welcome back to Féile and Phobail.
Thank you, Danny.
No stranger. Here we are in the beautiful surroundings of Iriseoir.
Yes.
After James Connolly.
Which features in the book.
Yes?
Yeah, there's actually a meeting in the book that I report in the book about radical Protestant women.
Well, this isn't your first book, of course, and I'd love to know how you managed to get the protocol passed and loyalist protests against the border down the Irish Sea just in time for the Republic.
Well, I orchestrated the whole thing, actually, but I'm modest about that. I don't like to talk about it.
Well, first of all, I think it's a very, very important book for Republicans and nationalists. You know, it gives you a real insight, cross-section of unionist thinking. Mm-hmm. But I'd like to ask you about, in terms of the scores of interviews, and some of the people would be in public life, like Sammy Wilson, but there are other people there who, you know, would be strangers to most of us. It's also the first time I've seen Chrissy Quinn interviewed, the mother of the 3 children killed in Ballymoney as a result of the Drumcree protests. So I'd like to just ask you about your methodology. I mean, when you sat down and thought, well, we're bringing this companion piece to the Northern Protestants and Unsettled People, what was your methodology? I mean, how did you decide who to approach? What response did you get? And then how did you decide you've the interviews, I think, maybe composed 4 areas geographically across the north. Could you speak to that, please?
Well, first of all, I decided to do the book because when I did the first book, which came out in 2000, it was just after the Good Friday Agreement, and it seemed like a good time to talk to Protestants and see what they were feeling, and that's where I talked about an unsettled people. People were tentatively looking into the future, but some people were quite panic-stricken about what lay ahead. So then 20 years on, it's the centenary of Northern Ireland. The demography of Northern Ireland has changed enormously. Protestants are probably about to become slightly a minority. And also we no longer have a unionist majority in Stormont. So it seemed like, and that we've had Brexit, of course, which the DUP and unionism largely supported, and a majority of people in Northern Ireland opposed. So it just seemed like another good time to actually look at where people were at. And I've always felt that the media, when it's covering Northern Ireland, takes an astonishingly narrow view of Protestants and unionism. You know, there's half a dozen people who get wheeled out every time. Most of them are men, most of them are older, most of them are straight, you know. So I just thought, I know Northern Ireland really, really well. I've been writing as a journalist and writer about here for decades, and I'm from here, I grew up here. So I just thought, I know that there are so many more people here who never get listened to, or who have really interesting things to say, but don't have any kind of opportunity to get them into the public domain. And the political unionism does tend to represent quite a narrow segment of Protestant thinking. I don't like the term PUL. I think it's sort of, it suggests Protestant Unionist Loyalist. It sort of suggests a circling of the wagons, a huddling together, you know.
And on the opposite side, the abbreviation never worked for the nationalists. No,
it never kind of caught on. It's, what is it, CNR? Yeah. CNR, no, you never hear that.
Sounds like a railway station.
Yeah. I don't know what PUL, it's a pullet, you know, a chicken. But so in a way, my methodology was very, very unscientific. It was intuitive. It was based on people that I knew, who I knew to be interesting and have interesting things to say. It was based on looking for particular demographics of people, like gay people, gay women in particular, who never get into the public domain.
I never realised there were so many gay people in the unionist community.
Well, there are.
And also people who took a very strong and principled stance on women's rights and abortion.
Yeah. Yes, very much so, and including individuals who found themselves on the wrong side of the law when it came to facing crisis pregnancies themselves. And also just, you know, people who are in mixed relationships, people who don't identify as being unionist at all, but are Protestant, people who identify as being unionist, but don't identify with political unionism. And there's an awful lot of those. So in some ways it was...
Sorry, in between writing the first book and the second book, Did you notice a sea change in it?
Well, I discovered a sea change when I started. You don't really necessarily notice things until you zone in, you know. So it was when I started doing the interviews for this book that I realised that there had been enormous changes. For example, far more people were willing to talk about being in mixed relationships. And you mentioned Chrissy Quinn. I actually had gone to meet Davy, her partner, because he's from a Protestant background in Carnanny, and he was the dad of one of the wee boys who was burned to death in that horrible, horrific incident. But Chrissy was there, and she talked to me as well, and really talking to them, the whole thing of dividing people up into Protestants and Catholics sort of became exposed as being quite nonsensical. You know, like her boys had gone to a Protestant primary school. They'd helped gather the wood for the 11th night bonfire. She identifies as Catholic, although she isn't a practicing Catholic, but her mum is married to a Protestant, and you know, he had Catholics in his family, and she was saying when she was bringing her children to school, a lot of the other mums there were also Protestants who were married to Catholics, or Catholics who were married to Protestants. And, you know, we are a much more mixed community than people think.
Yes.
And it's no longer, I think, you know, the whole sort of LGBTQ rights movement and the feminist movement have started people talking much more about how unhelpful binaries are. And Northern Ireland has a severe dose of the binaries, you know, I mean, this thing of the two communities. And there's far more than two communities.
But your independence and impartiality was called into question. I saw you on the with Gregory Campbell here before that Commons Committee,
the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee.
He was really trying to undermine the diligence of your work, especially with regards to this book and what you had found. I mean, how did you respond to that? That's why I was asking you about how representative were the interviews in the book of what's happening within the unionist community.
Well, I think they are very representative. I did represent the DUP, and I did represent the Ulster Unionist Party, and I did represent people in other political segments, but I also looked at people who are outside of that mainstream unionist system, and every single person in that book has a right to be there. And I think that what Mr. Campbell was doing was really sort of questioning my right to write the book at all. You know, he started out by saying that I had mistakenly referred to the city of my birth as Derry rather than Londonderry. Incidentally, I then decided to be pleasant and said, well, if you want me to call it Londonderry, Mr. Campbell, I will. And as a result then, as well as, you know, the anticipated pile-on of abuse from loyalists, I then started getting stuff from Republicans who started saying, she crawled by calling it this. She shouldn't have done that. She shouldn't have said Londonderry. But I mean, people in Derry have long since got over that, you know, like people interchangeably talk about Derry, Londonderry, they joke about Stroke City, well, you know. I was brought up a Protestant talking about Derry, you know.
Well, I was researching one of my books many years ago, and I was going through the newsletter in the Belfast Telegraph, and almost always they referred to it as Derry.
Yeah.
But it's not until the 60s, and particularly with the rise of Ian Paisley, that the name changes.
Yeah. And
the big emphasis becomes Londonderry, this, Londonderry, that. That's what I found anyhow.
Yeah. Well, it's the other thing that Gregory Campbell said was he started questioning me about where I lived. And if I lived in the Republic, and the implication seemed to be if I lived in the Republic, what right had I to be talking about the North? But I mean, Derry is a border city. Half the people in Derry live in Donegal and come across the border every day to work. Maybe not half, but lots and lots of people. And it's just this nonsense. But in some ways, that kind of makes the point that I'm looking at in the book, which is that political unionism has always operated on the basis of excluding people who don't walk a narrow line. You know, so that's why I've got Lundy on the cover.
It's a great cover.
It's a brilliant cover. It's by the photographer Trevor McBride from Derry, who is fascinated by Lundy. And this is the figure who is burned every year in Derry in a ceremony by the apprentice boys of Derry, who have this ceremony where they burn the man who wanted to reach a compromise with King James's forces, because Lundy, who was the governor of Derry in 1689, didn't feel that the city could withstand a prolonged siege, and he thought it would have been better to negotiate a surrender. But of course, no surrender has continued to be the main political thinking of unionism, particularly the DUPs, and the notion of anybody who steps out of line, even by questioning that, is a Lundy, is a traitor. So I think the difference between this book and my first Protestants book, An Unsettled People, is that I've kind of become quite not even resigned to, but reconciled with my own Lundification. I'm quite happy to be a Lundy now. There's lots of Lundys, and they're good company.
I want to go back to that later on, because I have a question to put to you. But in terms of the historic siege mentality, which is also responsible for partition, and taking 6 counties instead of the 9 counties of Ulster, I mean, obviously it's been assaulted by many changes, social and economic and politically, of course, by Brexit. So in terms of this complaint about our culture being attacked, and culture seems to be awfully represented just with burning bonfires with the effigies of your the people whom you don't like on top of it. What degree of change do you see within the unionist community as a result of all the changes in the South, for example, with
it's really interesting. It's really, really interesting. I mean, I think an awful lot of particularly young people, but not solely young people, are looking at the Republic and thinking, yeah, they've got a pretty crap government, but look at the changes that have occurred there. They've got same-sex marriage and they've got the right to abortion. But the interesting thing is that those were not...
There's no Rome rule.
There's no Rome rule. It's no longer a Catholic country, and the Catholic Church has been seen to have disgraced itself. It doesn't stop it continuing to try to assert itself, but it no longer has the authority that it had even 30 years ago. But young people are looking at that and thinking, well, that change came about because of social movement. So there's an awful lot of young people in Northern Ireland now who don't feel that they have to be involved in politics. They're involved in social movements as a way of bringing about change and political change and social change, because they see that that's what changed the Republic. And they're also looking at the Republic and thinking, it's still in Europe. You've still got, the rights to sort of the certain freedoms and benefits that there are from being in Europe. And as a result, I think the DUP heavily promoted Brexit because they thought that it was, as one woman put it to me in the book, border as high as you can get it, right, yeah. And all the foreigners out.
That's backfired.
They wanted a hard border, and instead what's happened is that they've actually succeeded in making a lot of Protestant people a lot more sort of open to at least thinking about the prospect that maybe a unified Ireland in the European Union might not be such a bad thing.
But even among the most extreme of unionists, you still see this sort of quote-unquote Ulster nationalism, where England doesn't love us, and the Republic doesn't love us either. We're on our own, which is a bit self-pitying. But that, I think among the young people there's much more foresight. They're much more open to arguments and to persuasion. And one of the issues that comes up time and time again in interviews, the National Health Service, and that's one of the big complaints about it. But even though it's been assaulted economically by successive Tory governments here, still in all, it seems to me that would be a huge magnet, huge attraction in a new Ireland.
I mean, I think one of the problems with the Republic as it is currently is that the government is very, very uninspiring. And if the government and the Republic really wanted to be serious about the prospect of a unified Ireland, the first thing they would need to do is look at the health service. Because, I mean, I know the health service here is pretty broken down, and a lot of people are still ending up having to save up and go private to get operations, because otherwise they're going to have to wait for years in pain and misery. But the fact is, if you're in the Republic, you go to see a doctor, it's 50, 60 quid. That is a significant problem. So if they put in a decent health service in the Republic, it would really be a big draw. But there's no imaginative approach, I think, unfortunately, as yet being shown in that regard. I really think the education systems, north and south, are going to have to radically change in any kind of new Ireland. Because
You're talking about in terms of integrated education?
Yes, in terms of integrated education and just a complete rethink of the whole curriculum. You know, we really need to look at the history of the conflict up here, and people in the Republic need to understand that people in the north, particularly nationalists, do feel that they have been abandoned by the Republic, and people in the border region, which has been really marginalised by partition and then further disrupted by Brexit.
Well, if you look back at the time of 1914 period, when allegedly Home Rule was passed and then suspended because of the First World War. During that period, John Redmond agreed against the wishes of the people of Tyrone and Fermanagh for those two counties to be included for a limited time in a new state. But also areas like Newry and parts of Derry and parts of South Armagh were supposed to go into the fledgling 26 counties. And that in a way I think explains the fury and the frustration of the people who were almost there and then end up in a sectarian orange state which discriminates against them in housing and unemployment, especially in those border areas.
Yeah, I mean, they're peripheral because you've got two centres in Dublin and Belfast, and they're remote from both of them. So yeah, no, there's all kinds of problems about the border, but I think that the main thing that's needed at the moment is for proper constructive conversations to be put together, which enable people to address the fears that they have, north and south, about moving forward together, whether it's in a unified Ireland or whether it isn't, But I think if you look at the way that the DUP has behaved has really, really unsettled Protestants again, because instead of trying to sort of be more inclusive of people who don't like their social conservatism on issues like gayness and abortion, they have seemed to sort of precipitate themselves backwards.
Well, it's the TUVs.
Yeah.
10% of their vote in that survey went to the TUV, so they've moved backwards, as you say.
Well, they're like... I think of Jim Allister, for all that he's a very competent politician in some ways he's also like Paisley pre-Martin McGuinness and Paisley going into power together. He operates in the same way that the old Paisley did. He's the kind of touchstone of traditional unionism, and anything that moves from that is a sellout. Anything, and obviously, he does represent a certain amount of anger that's there. Yeah. And I'd be interested in hearing your views on, can you quantify that anger? You do have you had the flag protests which petered out. Now you've got a lot of loyalist paramilitaries putting a big effort in behind opposing the border with these illegal marches, these protests, etc. How deep does it run? My sense of that is that the anger is really exaggerated. And I have gone to a couple of those anti-protocol protests, and I've observed a lot of those anti-betrayal act things that took place before the last Westminster election. And to my mind, certainly, like I went to the one in Portadown, for example, the anti-protocol protest in Portadown. It was very small, and the people who were there, an awful lot of them were people that I recognised from the Drumcree protests of the late 19th. Sorry?
And who recognised you?
Yeah, sadly, even with the shades and the mask, the anti-COVID mask, we recognised each other. But there are people who are basically anti the Good Friday Agreement. Like, that's the thing. It's not really about the protocol as such. It's about the Good Friday Agreement. And a lot of people in the unionist community who are of that more sort of staunch variety saw in Brexit an opportunity to damage the Good Friday Agreement. So you've got a lot of things that, as you say, they're proxy wars. But there is not any prospect, in my opinion, of a massive loyalist uprising with violence again. There's a small cohort of people who are desperately anxious to stir that up. But if you look at the riots that took place in April, they were really small, they were really obviously orchestrated, and a lot of the young people who were involved in them were quite vulnerable young people.
Some of the young people.
And some of them were quite vulnerable young people who have all kinds of problems in their lives and are very easily persuaded that a riot is just what they need to cheer them up. I'm being facetious, but like, they are young people who are easily exploited, and they shouldn't be exploited. And it's really, really good now, though, that there is a whole sort of movement of people who are in my book, who are like the Monkstown Boxing Club, who run
Nelson Mandela poster on the
Nelson Mandela, and they when there's something coming up, like, obviously riots being organised, they put on events for young people to keep them, to protect them from being drawn into that kind of activity.
Féile was set up and deliberately held around the week of the 9th of August to try and take young people away from rioting and from bonfires, which often led to conflict with the RUC and the British Army.
And leads to young people ending up in prison, not cared about and just abandoned. So there's a lot of very constructive work going on, but when you see something happening like what has just happened in East Belfast with the Irish language school for, what I can't remember, it's called uneasily in Irish, but what's it called? It's sort of a kindergarten thing, and in German, and little tiny children learning about colours and numbers in Irish, and yet there are people who justify trolling the people who'd organised that and putting up aggressive posters against them and accusing them of being associated with the IRA and stuff. Like, that sort of thing shouldn't be tolerated. But unfortunately, because the DUP very much kind of put to the fore this LCC that people had never heard of before, for the most part, the Loyalist Communities Council, which doesn't represent hardly anybody, but does represent old boys of the Loyalist paramilitaries of the 70s, 80s, 90s. They were suddenly given this prominence, and that kind of bigotry was suddenly regarded as being absolutely mainstream. And these are the repercussions of that, and they're the repercussions of people like Gregory Campbell saying if there was an Irish Language Act, he would use it as toilet paper. When that kind of language and hatred and contempt for people is allowed into the mainstream, inevitably it starts infecting the body politic, and you get things like Irish language knee skulls having to find new premises. It's horrible.
How do you think nationalists and Republicans should respond to what's in your book, and what you see the change in attitudes there? What should their approach be that would be positive and would contribute to progress? Well,
I've always felt that republicanism, I think the book is quite challenging to nationalists and Republicans as well, because, like, for example, one of the deep painful themes in the book.
Fermanagh, you discuss.
Yeah, one of the
perception
deep
that they were. The Protestant community was being deliberately driven out of Fermanagh by the IRA.
There are definitely villages in Fermanagh which have a high concentration of ex-security force people who moved back from the border. And republicanism would probably say, well, the UDR was aligned in some cases with loyalist paramilitaries. It was an anti-Catholic force and so on. But there are people who were in the UDR who don't identify with that version of the UDR, and who were driven out of their homes, and people who had to leave farms and things behind them, and their feeling of being exiled is real. They have as much right to their feelings about that as anybody else. But also just the feeling of, say, some of the people whose relatives were killed in the Enniskillen bomb, who I interviewed, like, their lives have been ruined by that, and they are angry and bitter about the fact that they feel that they never got justice any more than a lot of Catholic people got justice. And I think that republicanism has to acknowledge in a way that it never has, that there was a strong strand of sectarianism in the Republican campaign, and it hasn't been admitted. And it needs to be, and we have to go a lot deeper with legacy and reconciliation than we have done to date.
The big fear is that, truth and reconciliation would consist of Republicans telling all that they did and then that being pocketed. That there would be no response from the other side in terms of, the Ulster Unionist Party has never apologised or admitted to 50 years of rampant sectarian discrimination, not just for minority, but they made up the majority of people who immigrated. Similarly,
I know.
In terms of,
I agree with that.
In terms of I'm telling you, in terms of the initial violence, it was state violence against the nationalist community. So the Republican narrative would be, that's what provoked the armed struggle. Now, of course, once the armed struggle gets underway, one violent act begets another violent act. You David Irvine saying that it hadn't been for Bloody Friday, he wouldn't have joined the UVF, and unconscionable things happened during the conflict. But I don't think you'll get anybody unilaterally becoming and stating as honestly as you're saying there they should do until everyone's at the table.
Well, that's the whole thing. We obviously have had the appalling announcement by Brandon Lewis recently that they intend to just put a stop to legacy investigations. And we did have the Stormont House Agreement structures, which were left to languish for so long that the DUP is now sort of saying, well, they're not really fit for purpose anymore. So we no longer have an agreement on legacy. But just since we were talking about the Neescall, again, look at something like Raymond McCreesh Play Park. That did cause a lot of offence to Protestants living in that border area, and Republicans just refused to accept that they had any right to be offended by the idea that a play park could be named after an IRA man. So there's things like that don't necessarily amount to people having to come up and say, right, I was the person who did this shooting, or I was the person who planted that bomb. But there's just a general sort of a need to be much more sensitive to the fears and anguish of the other side of the community. But I completely agree with what you said about the failure to recognise the very, very real discrimination and legacy of discrimination against Catholics that underlay the beginnings of the IRA campaign. And I've talked about that in all of my work. And it clearly is a very strong element of, but now you've got this ridiculous thing where you get some unionists who say they'd never have actually acknowledged that occurred, that discrimination against Catholics, but now they're saying it's all gone too far the other way now. We're the second-class citizens. We need a civil rights movement, which is absolute nonsense because there's no evidence whatsoever that Protestants are more discriminated against than Catholics in the current political arrangements, and we've got much more sort of data now, reliable data to show, yes, there's still enormous poverty in Northern Ireland, but it's spread across the community.
Yeah, I don't want to dwell too much on the issues that you raised, but in terms of symbolism, the North is coming down with unionist symbolism. Yes. With First World War, with poppies, when I was a kid, the Orange Order marched on the Falls Road to Broadway Presbyterian Church, which was Culturland, red, white and blue bunting, but we had to stand there vanquished, do nothing about it. So the other thing about the Raymond McCreesh Park is that people would say they have a right to honour somebody who died on hunger strike, who died for his principles. Unionists have also objected to Casement Park. Yeah. So all of this runs deep and can be divisive. Of course, I understand that. We're running out of time, but I wanted to ask you one thing. The name Northern Irish, right, a lot of people and unionist people have said, well, I wouldn't consider myself British, or I wouldn't consider myself Irish, I would consider myself Northern Irish. Do you think that's a positive development? And I want to ask you something else as well. I was surprised to say that you said that your husband and children are Irish, you would consider yourself Northern Irish.
Yeah.
Because in a way, some people would say that this actually postpones us a reconciliation, not necessarily an assimilation, but reaching the point where we could all subscribe to a new Ireland, a new country.
Well, I regard Northern Irish as a kind of a provisional identity in a way.
Kerry Cork?
Well, it's kind of like I am a Northerner, and increasingly, well, obsessively Northern in my identity. So it seems sort of nonsensical just to say that I'm Irish, and I'm definitely not British. I've never identified as being British. So therefore I am Northern Irish, and I'm kind of proud of it. And it was funny because I talked in the book, I talked to a woman, Danielle. I can't remember Danielle's second name right now, but she is a big football coach for young women. And she, talks about how brilliant it is for young women to have a body image, for example, which isn't about just being skinny. But she talked about all the caps that she has won for the Northern Irish women's football team. And she's saying, like, those, they're not Irish, they're not British, they're not English, they're Northern Irish caps. And I'm not about to give that up, And I have a feeling of that about it. Like, you can be tentative about your identity. You can say, I'm neither Irish nor British. For the moment, I'm Northern Irish. If we had a united Ireland, I would probably see myself more wholeheartedly as being Irish.
I think there's a component, obviously, of British culture within us in terms of we hear on television we didn't see the O'Riordan's. We saw Coronation Street.
No, and thank God we weren't raised on the Late Late Show.
We grew up on the fields. We couldn't get the Late Late Show unless you put an rail up, and then you have to pay a license. So I think yes, there's a component of that. But I mean, do you consider that some unionists or unionists increasingly identifying themselves as Northern Irish? Do you consider that to be a positive development?
I think the fact that people are even thinking about identity as not something that's fixed, that's something you may have an element of choice in, is a good thing. But I think I read somewhere that, as a Derry girl, I always think everything has been sorted in Derry. And I know Martin McGuinness, at one point I read that he had said that he would call Northern Ireland if people wanted him to, even though it wasn't what he saw it as being, and I think that, that's why I said to Gregory Campbell, well, if you want me to call it Londonderry, I'll call it Londonderry. And I did call it Londonderry for him in the course of that interview, but it didn't satisfy him. But because he was determined to prove that I had no right to be speaking. But I think that just the idea that people look at identity and think, well, just because I was born this doesn't mean that I have to say it. That's bound to be a good thing in a place as obdurate as Northern Ireland.
Well, it shows that we're in transition.
Or the north of Ireland.
It shows that we're in transition. A lot of people.
And when I'm writing for southern newspapers, for example, I would often refer to the north. But it doesn't make any sense if you're writing in a British paper to talk about the north, because the north to someone in London is Yorkshire. It's not Northern Ireland. So often I just give my head peace and describe it as Northern Ireland. Because it explains where it is geographically.
Well, in your next book, the part of this trilogy, say in 10 years' time, where do you think we will be?
Well, first of all, there's 20 years between those two books.
Okay,
and even though I have sadly made very, very little provision for my old age, I hope that by the time I'm in my early 80s, I will not still be having to write books. But who knows? I might still be obsessive and compelled. I don't know. I think that
there's one in one direction, or it can go anywhere.
I think that political unionism is about to lose Northern Ireland because it hasn't had the generosity or imagination to share it. But where we go after that, I think, is up to everybody, and everybody is going to have to shift ground.
Especially the South.
Well, everybody, the South and the nationalist and Republican communities up here as well, are going to have to sort of realise that there are terrors in the Protestant community. And, it has to also be admitted, I think, by unionists that one of their fears surely must be, I hope we're not going to be treated as badly as we treated the Catholics when Northern Ireland was formed 100 years ago. So I think people need to be more politically generous if we're going to change Ireland. But I really, really think that there are a lot of people who are open-minded about that. I mean, there are people in the DUP who are open to the notion of a unified Ireland, and it doesn't mean that the DUP is going to vanish. They recognise that if there's a democratic vote for a united Ireland, that's where they're going to find themselves, and it doesn't mean that they're going to be without a home, and they're not going to have to, as Arlene Foster said she would leave the country, which was not a statement by someone who recognised their role as a leader. You know, is the whole of the Shankill Road going to get on the boat and go to England? I don't think so. You know, it was a privileged statement to make, the statement of a person of privilege. Mm-hmm. So,
well, as someone from Planterstock, I'm not going anywhere. Susan, thank you very much.
Thank you very much,
I wish
Danny.
you well with the book, Northern Protestants on Shifting Ground. Excellent, and certainly a lot to be learned from it from a nationalist Republican point of view.
Thank you.